Welcome to the Harold B. Lee Library's House of Learning Lecture Series. I'm Mike Hunter, the coordinator for this year's lecture series. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 119, it says, "Organize yourselves and establish a house, even a house of faith, a house of learning." Through this lecture series, the Harold B. Lee Library seeks to establish a house of learning by bringing students and faculty together for a discussion of ideas. Today, we are privileged to have as our featured speaker Dirk Elzinga, Associate Professor in BYU's Department of Linguistics and English Language. Professor Elzinga received his BA from the University of Utah in German Language and Literature and his MA in Linguistics also from the University of Utah. He received his PhD in Linguistics from the University of Arizona in 1999, his dissertation focusing on the phonology of consonants and Gojut. He has been involved in documenting languages of the Great Basin and Southwest since graduate school, and he has worked with the Shoshoni, Gojut, and Kemawevi communities as part of their linguistic documentation and revitalization efforts. Before coming to BYU in fall 2001, Professor Elzinga worked at the University of Utah for 3 years, where he was part of the original team which began digitizing and transcribing recordings of Shoshoni elders made by Dr. Wick Miller in the 1960s and 1970s. More recently, he has published a joint work with Dr. David Eddington of the Department of Linguistics and English Language at BYU on psycholinguistic aspects of English phonology. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Elzinga.
Thank you. I would like to thank Brother Hunter and the Lee Library for extending me this invitation to come and speak to you today. I want to do 3 things today. First, I would like to present what I think are some interesting facts about the pronunciation of Shoshoni, a language indigenous to the Great Basin and Rocky Mountains. I also would like to use this data to introduce you to 3 different theories of phonological knowledge, the knowledge which we all draw upon when we speak and listen to language. These 3 theories are classical phonemics, optimality theory, and then exemplar modeling. Third, I also want to talk a little bit about how minority and endangered languages can help us come to a better understanding about how language with a capital L works. So first, a little background on Shoshoni. Shoshoni is a member of the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan language family. It is related to languages such as Paiute, Hopi, and Nahuatl. So if you look at the family diagram there, it's way over on the right, about in the middle, so it belongs to the central Numic branch there. Shoshoni is spoken through much of the Great Basin and Western Rockies. This map shows the historical territories occupied by speakers of Numic languages. The 2000 census reported 12,026 people who identified themselves as Shoshoni. Of those who identified themselves as Shoshoni, 2,033 reported using a language other than English in the home, and one would presume that language was Shoshoni. This figure is likely not accurate since language use is typically underreported among Native American populations. In their course book on Shoshoni, published in 2002, Drusilla Gould and Chris Lothar estimate that there are probably more like 5,000 speakers of the language. So I want to talk to you about phonology. Phonology is the study of the organization of speech sounds in the brain and their use in language. Another definition that's used is the system of relationships among the speech sounds of a language. And I will be using the word phonology in both senses today. All right, so to start off with, I want to talk about a series of sound patterns of Shoshoni that are quite well known in the literature, mostly in their appearance in Southern Paiute, which is closely related. These are the final features. There are 4 final features in Shoshoni, and they're listed here. I'm only going to be talking about spirantization and nasalization, so if you don't know what that means, that's okay. You'll have plenty of chance to find out. The other 2, gemination and aspiration, involve some complications that we're not going to discuss today. So, first, I want to play a few sound files so you can hear what some words in Shoshoni sound like. So let's start right here.
Appa.
There we go.
Poto. Taka.
Now you notice in each of these words there's a consonant in the middle that's kind of lengthened and kind of just held out for a little bit. But what we're really interested in is how these consonants in the middle sound.
Tumbe. Pura. Kago.
And then here.
Yamba. Kundu. Pongo.
So 4 kinds of sounds are going to be important here. First, we'll talk about stops. Stops are sounds which are made by briefly blocking the flow of air from the lungs in various places in the mouth. Continuance. If you don't understand these funny symbols, that's okay. Just remember the definitions and recognize them when you see them. Continuance are sounds that are made by squeezing the airflow a little bit, not completely blocking it, but narrowing the channel through which the air will flow. Nasals are sounds that are made with airflow through the nose. And you all know what vowels are. Okay, so these 4 sounds are going to be especially important when we talk about the sound patterns of Shoshoni. In addition, we also want to talk about the distinction we can make between sounds that are voiced and sounds that are voiceless. Voiced sounds are made with vocal fold vibration, and voiceless sounds are made without that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, we can also divide up the sounds in a different way. We can talk about where in the mouth these sounds are produced. So labial sounds are sounds that are made with the lips. Coronal sounds are sounds that are made with the tip of the tongue against the roof of the mouth. And dorsal sounds are sounds that are made with the back of the tongue against the roof of the mouth. All right, now, that's a lot to think about all at once, but don't worry, we'll come back to these things over and over again through the course of this talk. So, as we look at these sounds and where they appear in words, we see that there are some generalizations we can make. First, the continuants, these sounds that are produced by squeezing the airflow, occur between vowels. So if you look at the center column there, that's where we find these continuants. Voiced stops follow nasals. So if you look under the nasalizing column, you see we have B, D, and G following the nasal consonants. Voiceless stops, P, T, and K, begin words or are doubled up between vowels. And you can see some of those all over in the chart. Okay. The basic idea of classical phonemics is that there are 2 kinds of differences among speech sounds. There are the differences that matter and the differences that don't matter. So let's take the sounds T and S. So so they're clearly different sounds, and but if we take the T and replace it with an S, we get a different word. So this difference is a difference that matters. T is different from S, and this difference matters. It creates a new word. This property that T and S have is called contrast. Sounds that contrast are referred to as phonemes. So you may have heard that word before. Now you know what it means. Okay, now let's take T again. So again, remember, we're talking about differences that matter and differences that don't matter. So we just saw differences that matter. When you replace one sound out with another, you get a new word. Now, some differences don't matter. So English speakers around the world have at least 2 different ways they can pronounce the word atom. So in American English, we tend to pronounce that T with a kind of a really short D kind of sound, which we can symbolize with an R-looking kind of thing, and that's the one on the right. Okay, in other parts of the English-speaking world, they articulate the T very clearly, atom. Okay, but this difference doesn't really matter. Both of these pronunciations are seen as being pronunciations of the same word, and English speakers will understand either of them. So the exchange of T and the flap, this kind of D-like sound, in English is unconscious and predictable. That is, English speakers who do this typically aren't aware that they are doing it. And this is what I mean by it's an unconscious kind of sound. But one of the most surprising things is that it actually is predictable. So linguists refer to sounds that behave this way as allophones. So another pair of words we can look at to see how this works is the word atom and its related word atomic. So here in these two related words, we see both of these pronunciations. So we can make a generalization. We talk about T and flap as being allophones of T, and we can talk about where they occur. So we find the flap before unstressed vowels, and we find the T everywhere else. Okay, there's a little bit of a simplification, but that's basically how it works. So we refer to sounds that behave this way as allophones of a phoneme. And this pattern that they enter into is known as complementary distribution. So we find one sound in this set of environments and the other sound everywhere else. They don't overlap. So there's a simple analogy that might help at this point. So take your favorite superhero. Okay, mine's Batman. Now, it's a curious fact about Batman that he and Bruce Wayne are never in the same place at the same time. So it's either Batman or Bruce Wayne. So why is that? Well, of course, because it's the same guy. So you could say that Batman and Bruce Wayne are in complementary distribution. In those contexts where it is appropriate for Batman to be, so chasing the bad guys, we find Batman. In all other contexts, we find Bruce Wayne. Okay, so this is an analogy that might help you understand this idea. So when we find sounds that work this way, we consider those sounds to be allophones of a single phoneme. And this is a difference that doesn't really matter. Okay, so back to Shoshoni. So remember the generalizations that we made. Continuants occur between vowels. Voiced stops follow nasals. Voiceless stops occur elsewhere. Now I've changed the description just a little bit to highlight this elsewhere property. I mean, really what it is we're saying the voiceless stops occur everywhere else where it isn't more narrowly specified. Okay? This is complementary distribution. So we can go through each of these separately. And as you see there, not only are the individual sounds in complementary distribution with each other, but as groups of sounds, we also find this same pattern. So we have voiceless stops as the phonemes. They become continuants between vowels, voiced stops following nasals, and voiceless stops elsewhere. So it looks like we've ended up where we started. I mean, we started out with these generalizations before I started talking about phonemes and allophones and all of that. But really what we're doing now is making a claim about what speakers know. We now claim that when a speaker of Shoshoni pronounce v between vowels, such as in the word for pine nut, diva, that is really the phoneme p, and that the speaker is somehow aware of this. This means that there really are two levels of phonological knowledge. A level at which basic contrasts, those differences that are expressed by phonemes, a level at which those are remembered and maintained, and then a level of allophones, in which these different variants or pronunciations of these sounds occur. Words are stored in the mental lexicon in their phonemic form. So a Shoshoni speaker will hear diva, but might actually think about that with a P rather than the V. Okay? So this is the claim of classical phonemics. All right, let's move on. Now, it might have occurred to you, as we were talking about this, maybe it didn't, but it might have, that spirantization of T in Shoshoni looks an awful lot like English flapping. If it didn't occur to you, then I'll draw your attention to it now. As we look to see what happens, we see that a T is pronounced as a flap between vowels in Shoshoni. A T is also pronounced as a flap between vowels when the second vowel is unstressed in English. Okay? So they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. In fact, the whole series of Shoshoni allophonic rules are similar to rules attested elsewhere in languages of the world, including Spanish, Welsh, and Hebrew. These rules, along with English flapping, belong to a class of rules that are known as lenition. Now, of course, Shoshoni flapping isn't exactly the same as English flapping, or the lenition rules found in Welsh, Spanish, or Hebrew, but they show a family resemblance. When linguists find these kinds of rules that seem to cross linguistic boundaries, it leads them to believe that there's something more fundamental at work, something rooted perhaps in the physiology of speaking or in the auditory nature of speech itself that leads language users to take shortcuts or to be especially careful when speaking. So this leads to competing pressures on us as language users. On the one hand, we want to preserve the underlying phonemes so that we can distinguish one word from another. On the other, we want to conserve effort while speaking, which may lead to more relaxed pronunciations and the proliferation of allophones. So a way to think about this is we speak in order to be understood, but if we can save a little bit of effort, so much the better. Optimality theory is a framework which provides linguists a way to resolve these kinds of conflicts. So here's another example that shows you how it might work. So Isaac Asimov, in his robot stories, proposed the 3 laws of robotics to govern the behavior of robots. They are: a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And finally, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Now, notice that these second and third laws have these little escape clauses. So, little statements saying when it's okay to break that law. This is an important feature of the 3 laws of robotics. Now, let's imagine a scenario where a robot is confronted by a set of circumstances that leads to a conflict among the 3 laws. So let's suppose a man commands a robot to kill my wife. There are at least 4 possible outcomes. First, the robot kills the wife. Second, the robot kills the man. Third, the robot does nothing. Fourth, the robot destroys itself. So what is the robot going to do, taking into account that at least one of the 3 laws will have to be broken? Let you think about that for a minute. Okay, you thought about it? Okay, the correct answer is number 3. The robot does nothing. Here's why. The first and second possible outcomes involve violations of the first law, for which there is no escape clause. It is strictly forbidden and prohibited to harm a human being. In addition, the second possible outcome also involves an unnecessary violation of the second law. By killing the human instead of his wife, the robot has violated a direct order. Now, the third and fourth possible outcomes also involve violations of the second law. But these violations are sanctioned by the escape clause since the robot is disobeying the command in order to avoid harming a human being. But the fourth possible outcome also involves a gratuitous violation of the third law because the robot destroys itself and fails to protect its own existence. So really, the best thing for the robot to do is nothing. So this is an example of how conflicting requirements might lead to a problem in trying to make an analysis. Now, in Asimov's original statement of the laws, the second and third laws have these qualifications that allow the laws to be broken under specific circumstances. So let's restate the laws as absolutes without the escape clauses. So they'll look like this. So a robot may not injure a human being. This one's going to be exactly the same. The second one, a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings. No exceptions. Third, a robot must protect its own existence. Also, no exceptions. Now, it's clear for these laws to work, they're going to have to be prioritized. So if we rank them this way, then we should be able to get the same kind of behavior that we had with the laws as originally stated. But these laws are a little simpler. You don't have to include this escape clause in the law itself. You just rank them and say this one takes absolute priority, that one is more important than the third, and we should be okay. Okay, so the tool of the trade in optimality theory is the tableau. This is how we check to see what is going on, how these laws will interact and conflict with each other. So as a reminder, here are 4 possible outcomes. Now here's how we read this table. So the possible outcomes each introduce a row of the table. Each of the laws heads a column. The asterisks indicate that a possible outcome violates the law. The exclamation point marks a violation that excludes the possible outcome from the competition. Shading the cell shows that whether the outcome satisfies or violates the law doesn't matter anymore for the selection of the correct outcome. And the pointing finger indicates the correct outcome. So let's work through this table quickly. So the first and second possible outcomes are immediately ruled out. And you see that by the asterisks under no harm. Okay, what's more, since the third and fourth outcomes don't violate this law, the first and second one are disqualified. And that's the meaning for the exclamation point. Since they're disqualified, it doesn't matter from here on out whether they satisfy or violate the other laws. They're out. So it's now it's between the second and the third and the fourth outcomes. So the third outcome and the fourth outcome both consist of violations of the obeying a human law. In addition, the fourth outcome also violates the self-preservation law. So that one's out. And the third one is the one that's left over. Now, one of the interesting things about optimality theory is that very often we find situations like this where we can't find a perfect candidate or a perfect outcome, so we'll just take the best one, the optimal one, given the set of circumstances we have available. Okay, enough talk about robots. Let's go back to Shoshoni. So how is this going to work in Shoshoni? First, I want to draw your attention to this variability that we've been talking about. So we talked about the phonemes, P, T, and K, having these different allophones. So we find this kind of a variability. They behave differently in different circumstances. Okay, and so here's just a reminder. Here's the variation that we find. Okay, so here are some more examples from Shoshoni. This time I've given you examples that have that are related to each other by having a possessive marker. So the word for mother, bia, the spirantizing form becomes nbia. So we get this v, and the nasalizing mbia. So we find this variation in the phoneme P in these different environments. Now, we can identify two phonetic tendencies here. Consonants tend to be voiced, that is pronounced with vocal fold vibration, when they are between voiced sounds. And we can abbreviate this tendency as voice. Also, consonants tend to be continuants when they occur between continuants. And we can abbreviate that with a C-O-N-T. Okay? We also want to keep in mind that we have contrasts. And language and being able to communicate depends on the fact that we contrast one sound with another, that is going to make a difference, that some differences matter. And we can refer to this as faithfulness, or just faith. So in Shoshoni, it's pretty clear that both voice and continuancy take precedence over faithfulness, because we find this variation where these phonemes vary in exactly these ways. And so we can represent it this way. So we have this ranking relationship. Now, here's another tableau that shows us how this works. One other thing, we're not clear so we know that both voicing and continuancy outrank faithfulness, but we don't know what the ranking with respect to each other. And actually, it turns out not to matter. So here's how we can look at this and understand this, this tableau. So in the first example, my mother, Nubia, the first possible pronunciation has a P. Well, this violates both of these phonetic constraints, voicing and continuancy. The second one, which has a B, doesn't violate voicing, but it does violate continuancy. In addition, since it's different than the phoneme P, it also violates faithfulness. It's different in that it's voiced where the phoneme is voiceless. So what we're really left with is the last candidate. It does the best on voicing and continuancy, but it does pretty lousy at faithfulness. It's a lot different than a P. Looking at the second example, your mother, Mbia. So we see that the first candidate violates this first constraint. We find the P as a voiceless sound between voiced sounds, so there's a violation. Continuancy has nothing to say here because we don't have sounds between continuants to worry about, so we can just leave that one aside. So that means now we're going to have a tie between the second and third candidates. They both satisfy voicing, continuancy doesn't apply, so they're both good. So now we look to see which one is more different from the underlying phoneme. And it turns out that the last one is, so the second one wins. It's more like a P than V is, and that's enough. Again, it's not a perfect sound, but it's good enough, given the phonetic processes and the phonetic requirements we placed on it. Finally, we look at the word for mother itself, and there is no reason to change that P to anything else. It is not subject to any of these phonetic pressures. So any change to that P is going to mean that that candidate is no good anymore. And so the one that emerges as the correct outcome is the one that is most like the underlying phoneme. Okay, so does that make sense? So the benefits of optimality theory are that it recognizes inherent conflicts in language and provides a mechanism for resolving them. Remember, in the Shoshoni case, the conflicts are between these phonetic pressures to have sounds kind of be easy to pronounce between vowels and the phonemic pressures, if you will. We want these sounds, these contrasts to be preserved. Optimality theory also provides kind of a functional explanation of phonetic processes. So when we looked at these examples in classical phonemics, we were able to describe them, and classical phonemics provides us with the vocabulary for talking about these differences that matter and these differences that don't matter. But we're really kind of left at loose ends when it comes to explaining why. But now we can include a little bit of those explanations using optimality theory. We still need to talk about phonemes, but now we understand some of the whys of allophones. Okay. Now, exemplar modeling. So far, I've kind of silently made the assumption that we say things exactly the same way every time we talk. Now, of course, this isn't true. But classical phonemics nor optimality theory really provide very good ways of coping with this kind of variation. So when I look at my field notes, and when I listen to recordings of Shoshoni and related languages, I find all kinds of things where they shouldn't be. For example, I find P, B, and beta between vowels, when really we only expect beta to occur. So again, classical phonemics and optimality theory can't account for this. At best, they can say that these rules or these constraints are tendencies, but that's not really an explanation. And what's more is it's not just Shoshoni speakers that do this with P. They do it with T, they do it with K. English speakers do this kind of thing too, and so do speakers of all languages. In fact, this kind of variability is just as much a part of language as regular allophonic processes. So, if my goal is to make an accurate description of the pronunciation of Shoshoni, I have to at least mention this kind of variation, even if I can't explain it. As I said, it's not just P, it's also T and K. It's not just Shoshoni, it's English and all other languages. So this variation really is a part of what it means to be a language. So we might be going about this the wrong way. Instead of starting with rules that we refine to cover the majority of the cases and then just try to sweep the exceptions under the rug, let's start with the variation itself and see if this variation obeys laws of its own that might help us understand linguistic behavior. So exemplar modeling is a group of related frameworks that try to do this very thing. And some of the basic principles of exemplar modeling are the following. Every word we utter and every word we hear is stored in memory. When we speak, we draw upon this store to construct appropriate utterances. If we don't have an example handy, we make one up based on the examples that are most like what we're after. Okay, so let's use another analogy. So let's suppose you have 100 marbles in a bag. 85 of them are green, 10 of them are red, and 5 of them are white. Now, without looking, draw a marble out of the bag. What are the chances of drawing a green marble? 85%, obviously. What about a red marble? 10%. A white marble, 5%. Now, let's take this analogy and apply it to these different allophones of P in Shoshoni. So we can think of the green marbles as being like the continuant, the red marbles being like B, and the white marbles being like a P. Okay? So what are the chances that a beta, the V, is going to be the pronunciation of a particular word? Well, it's going to depend on how many examples of that sound we have in our mental store. So the more examples we have of beta, the more likely it is that we will select that one as a pronunciation of words that include the phoneme P, for example, the way to think about it. So voicing and continuancy represent physiologically real influences on pronunciation. So we do expect V to show up between vowels quite often in Shoshoni, even if it doesn't happen all of the time. So I wanted to try something out using an exemplar model to model some of this kind of variation. So I used a set of data from Southern Paiute. Edward Sapir published grammar, collection of texts, and a dictionary of Southern Paiute in 1930 and 31. I looked at the texts, and I gleaned all of the examples that I could of allophones of P. So Southern Paiute, like Shoshoni, has this kind of variation that we find, and it follows pretty much the same kinds of patterns. So I wanted to use the Southern Paiute data because the data is clear, the transcriptions are very meticulous and precise, and there's lots and lots of stuff to look at. So this is the result that I found. So let's see, where did I go? So the challenge for the exemplar model I was working with was to see that if it could predict the correct range of allophones, as well as how often each of these allophones showed up, even if the conditioning factors weren't explicitly included in the simulation. So I ran it on the computer, and this is the table that I compiled when I was done. Now here's how to read this table. So each row of the table is headed by some allophone of P. The number after that is how many times that particular allophone of P showed up in the texts. So P occurred 1,608 times. Okay, the rounded P, the pwa, occurred 37 times, and so on. Okay? The columns headed by each of these allophones are the predictions that were made by the exemplar modeling software that I was using. So if you look at the upper left corner, we see that P was predicted to occur 1,599 times as an example of P. And if you look at the far right column, this is 99.4% correct. Okay? Now, it's not perfectly correct. And if you look at all of the others, you'll see that none of them they didn't get any of them exactly right. But it got them mostly right. We find this variation. So the overall correct prediction rate in this simulation was 95.9%. That's pretty darn good. And that tells me that this model does account for allophones. It understands that speakers of language do categorize and do think of things in some way like this. But 95.9% isn't 100%. It isn't perfect. It didn't get all of them right. Well, why not? Well, the imperfection is the prediction is a measure of the variability of speakers. We don't expect 100% correct predictions, and we don't get it. We expect variability, and we see it. So, to sum up, classical phonemics gives us a vocabulary and a way of talking about categorization of sounds. We have differences that matter, differences that don't matter, and a way to talk about how we can relate those kinds of sounds together. Optimality theory provides us with a way to resolve conflicting requirements. It draws upon the observation that allophonic rules can cross linguistic boundaries and that they are often decomposable, if you will, into physiological or acoustic factors. This gives us a finer-grained way of talking about sound patterns of language. And again, it provides us with a way to accommodate conflicting requirements. Finally, exemplar modeling provides us a way to deal with variation that is inherent in any language by starting out from the assumption that language will vary. Okay, we remember each of the individual instances and we draw on that store as needed. If we can't find one, we make one up based on that store. So now the remaining question is, why do we have to look at Shoshoni or other minority and endangered languages to find this out? Couldn't we just play with and refine our theories of phonological knowledge using English and other familiar languages? Well, the short answer is no. And the long answer is no. Okay? Not all languages are like Chinese, English, Spanish, Hindi, or Arabic, the 5 most commonly spoken languages in the world. Before today, it probably would never have occurred to you that P, the phoneme P, could be pronounced as anything other than P. Shoshoni taught us this lesson. And it can teach us many more besides. Examining these exotic languages gives us more data points as we try to understand how language with a capital L works. An ethnobotanist acquaintance of mine once told me that 85% of the plant species found in the Great Basin are unique to it. They are not found anywhere else in the world. This is a picture of Stella Lake in Great Basin National Park. The Goshoots had names for all of these plants. Not only did they have names for them, they knew where to find them, they understood their life cycles, and they knew how if they were useful to man and how, whether it's food, medicine, construction material, or what have you. This knowledge was passed down to successive generations as part of the cultural heritage of the Goshoot people, along with their traditional stories about coyote, cottontail, skunk, and mouse. A few years ago, I worked with a woman in translating an oral narrative recorded in the late 60s. This is the woman on the tape. Her name is Maud Moon. She was a Goshoot storyteller and a wonderful source of knowledge about Goshoot language and culture. She was the primary linguistic consultant for Dr. Wick R. Miller, who I had the privilege of working with. Mrs. Moon is the source of much of what we know about the Goshoot variety of Shoshoni. So this was the woman on the tape. This was an audio tape, but it was clear from how the tape went what was going on was that there was a big table laid out with all kinds of different plants that had been collected and placed on the table. And Mrs. Moon went around and pointed to each plant and say, oh, this is one of those. This is what we call it. This is what we use it for. And very often she would even have a story that mentioned that plant. So a few years ago, I was working with this woman, Imogene Steele, who is also a Goshoot, to translate some of these narratives that Mrs. Moon had left behind. As we started working through the plant tape, Imogene started to get kind of sad, kind of depressed. And I asked her what the problem was, and she said, I just don't know these words anymore. And I don't even think my mother and my uncles know these words. And we talked about that a little bit. Obviously, Maud Moon knew all of those words. Not only did she know the words and the plants to look at, but she knew what they were for. She knew stories about them. And that knowledge had disappeared within the space of maybe 2 generations. It was gone. She recognized some of them, sure, because some of them were familiar plants to everybody, but many of them were gone. So Imo finally realized how much the Goshoots had lost as a result of language loss. Now we can talk about the reasons for this language loss. That's not my purpose here today. I did want to play this little sound clip. This is a round dance song that she sang for me.
Bayam baru, wena, nande yo, wena, nande yo. Wena bayam baru wena nande yo wena nande yo wena.
So I asked her what that song meant. She said she didn't know. She learned it when she was a little girl, and she remembered it from then, and she could sing it to me. She knew when those songs were appropriate and what they were for, but she couldn't tell me what the song meant anymore. It's not just the Goshoots that are facing this problem. Any community which is losing an endangered language is in danger of losing knowledge of their environment and of their ancestors' worldview. These things are built into language in ways that we as linguists are still trying to understand. Now, what can you do? Well, you can find out more. You don't have to be a linguist to be interested in endangered or minority languages. There are several good books that are available written for the layman. I recommend this one in particular by David Harrison, When Languages Die. It's very readable, and it's a fascinating study of his work in Siberia with several of the indigenous languages there. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago, The Linguists. This was actually an audience favorite at the Sundance Film Festival. You can buy it online. That's all I'll say about that. I don't want this to be a commercial, but this is it's an excellent film, and it shows David Harrison and a colleague of his traveling the world, looking at different places where there are endangered languages spoken and trying to kind of understand what the language situation is. There's also a really fun website that includes an atlas of endangered languages. You can take a look at that to see, maybe where your hometown is, what indigenous languages were spoken there, and what their status is now. Just in closing, I would like to say that this past 20 years that I've had in working with Shoshoni have been extremely rewarding. I find it sometimes difficult to get to know new people and to make acquaintance with new people, but this has been a lot of fun. This lady that I work with on and off, that I've worked with on and off over the past 10 years or so, Imogene, she's just a delightful person to work with. And it's been a great pleasure of mine to not only find these things out for myself, but to share them with her. She gets really excited. She loves finding out more about her language. And she was really excited to hear about some of these kinds of, maybe more simple kinds of linguistic notions, because she had this sense of, my language is unique, my language is valued. And I thank you for your attention.